Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here to talk about some of the trends in urbanization and how this is impacting on risk. I worked on this chapter and also this issue with colleagues from the International Institute of Environment and Development, with David Satterthwaite, David Dodman, and also friends from Argentina. It was really a work that we did partly together. Just to start us off, I'd like to just draw out two sort of striking trends that we see in terms of urbanization. First of all, that there's a very large growth over the last 50 years and coming up in the next years up until projected to 2030 by the UN, that urbanization, especially in low and middle income countries, has been increasing drastically. 737 million people were living in urban areas. This is cities, both cities and small urban centers in 1950, and projections to 2030 show that we'll have 5 billion people living in urban areas, cities and small urban centers. And also striking in this is that the growth of these urban populations is largely, as you see by the yellow line, is that all of these most of this growth is in low and middle income nations. And by the line below that most of this growth is actually in Asia. By 2030, we have 55% of the world's urban population will be living in Asia. So the major growth in cities is happening in Asia. We have slightly in Africa also. And the second point I'd like to raise, just as another striking point, is that the economic losses and fatalities differ drastically if we look at low and middle income countries and high income countries. On the graph here, we show that the fatalities in low income countries from tropical cyclones is incredibly high compared to those in high income countries, and whereas the economic losses in high income countries are incredibly high. And a lot of this is also linked to urbanization. In Japan, we see more people, in Japan actually, more people are exposed to cyclones than in the Philippines, for example. However, if both the Philippines and Japan were affected, exposed to a cyclone of the same magnitude, there would be 17 times more mortality in the Philippines than in Japan. And the reasons for this, if we look at the underlying risk drivers, the underlying reasons that these types of fatalities will happen, it's largely based on the way cities and small urban centers are built. And so this is what I would like to focus on in the next few minutes. Just to bring it briefly, because I wanted to think about what are the key issues for humanitarian actors. So just to point those out before we go further. First of all, I think that the information is looking at how cities are affected is helpful for longer term programming to understand the different types of risks there are in cities, and also how to respond in urban contexts, I think is quite important. So why are cities the location of risk? I think the very simple answer that we all know is that cities and urban centers are a concentration of capital, a concentration of built capital, a concentration of resources, a concentration of economic capital. And certainly we see that as being one of the main reasons why there are great risks in cities. This is a photo of the Gulshan district in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where myself and colleagues have been doing some work for a couple of years, particularly on this informal settlement that you see on the foreground, which is called Karail. But if we look more closely, I think, we see that there's actually a different kind of urban risk. I'm missing some. Hang on, let me go back. We see that there's a different kind of risk. first of all, I think that I mean, part of it is because their risk is not even across all of urban areas. For example, it's often concentrated in informal settlements. People are often forced to build in unsafe areas such as floodplains, steep slopes. Usually this is because these are the only sites that are available to people because they want to be close to areas of employment. For example, in Karel, as you see pictured here, is very close to this high-income district, and so a lot of people are able to have access to jobs in these areas or services working for these areas. If we look more specifically at what's happening in Bangladesh, we see that in Bangladesh, we see that urban areas grew by 38% compared to rural areas in the last 10 years. And cities like Dhaka, which is the largest city, have constant sort of flooding issues where excessive rainfall leads to water clogging and flooding in the areas. In July, for example, in 2009, there were 333 millimeters of rain fell in a 24-hour period, which was the largest in 50 years. So we see that there are sort of, when we look more specifically at cities, we see that there are specific ways that risk is accumulated. For example, in Karel district, part of the reason that there's a lack of there's increased flooding in these areas is because of the lack of infrastructure. You can see here what the types of pipe water infrastructure that are very informal and which are very, very vulnerable when flooding is happening. We see the sort of drainage infrastructure, pipes being built, and also a lack of I mean, these areas, for example, on the bottom left, are very largely affected when it's flooding. They have, I mean, the whole place stays flooded for several days on end. And one of the other major ways that that people are at risk are insecure livelihoods and tenure. We did a survey in Karel district looking at 30 households and how they are coping with increased flooding and increased hazards. And if we look at sort of in more detail at that data, we see 40% of the population in this one district are under the age of 10. So therefore, a large amount of young people are dependent on a small amount of older people. 60% are dependent on 40% that are income earners. That's only 40% of the population is earning an income. No one in this community has security of tenure. 30%, people pay up to 30% income as rent. I know this, I mean, I pay probably more than that in London, but if you're looking at this large sort of cash-based economy that people are living on, 30% on rent is very, very high when they're paying for other services such as water, such as electricity, food, and everything that it costs to live in cities. 73% of the families experienced water clogging in the last few years from excessive rainfall and flooding. And 73% of these households had experienced waterborne diseases. And also this is affecting their livelihood. 63% had lost working days during disasters because when the flooding comes, they cannot work either because of sickness or because their job is no longer there. So if we think about how we want to understand risk, I think there are different sort of ways of understanding risk. And what I did in the chapter was to look at what are the different types of available data to understand risk. And I think this is interesting for humanitarian agencies to be able to think about and to think about how to prioritize risk reduction, because it depends on how risk is viewed. Do we view risk as economic impacts, thus things like insured assets, or how it affects households? Do we look at multi-hazard or single-hazard risk? Do we look at small and medium-sized events or only large-scale events? I mean, usually humanitarian agencies are responding to large-scale events. But actually, when we look at it, these medium and small-scale events have very large impacts on households, on families, and on whole communities. And so what I did, I mean, the CRED database is, as David was saying, is an incredibly rich source of information to understand at an international scale what are the disasters, and especially the larger scale disasters. But the types of data that are available about urban risk are actually quite different. So what I did was to look at what is the available data about urban risk. How do we view urban risk? And one of them was the Munich Re, using their natural hazards database. They sort of did a pilot study on trying to understand what are the cities that are most at risk. And they looked at cities over 2 million and cities that were sort of the most economically important cities in the country. And so what this type of analysis brings, they looked at exposure to hazards, so the type of hazards, and multi-hazards, not just being one hazard, but several different kinds of hazards: earthquake, wind, flood, volcano, etc. They looked at vulnerability of the built environment, and they looked at the values of exposed properties. So in doing this, they found the highest risk cities were Tokyo, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto in Japan, Miami, New York, Hong Kong. So for example, this really shows that the highest risk cities are those with these large accumulation of assets. And that out of the 20 highest risk cities, 17 of these are in high income countries. If we compare that to a study that was done by Nichols for looking at the port cities with exposed population, and he looked at what's happening in 2005 and projecting up to 2070, looking at the impacts of sea level rise and other climate change impacts on port cities. This graphic here shows that in 2005, these are the highest risk cities. What it shows is that 38.5 million people are exposed to floods in port cities. These are large port cities, so over 1 million people. And 65% of these exposed people are in Asia. So this shows a very, very high risk of accumulation for surge-induced flood events in port cities in Asia. And what he also looked at is in 2070, bearing in mind the problems with population and urbanization projections, but he found that 14 out of 20 of the most exposed cities in 2070 would also be in Asia. So we see a very, very high risk of urban flooding in Asia, being 2 in China, 4 in China, and 2 in Bangladesh. Another sort of perspective of looking at how risk can be concentrated in cities is the Desinventar database. And this has been a very interesting look at small-scale disaster events. So it's quite different than CRED in that it sort of looks, whereas CRED is looking at larger events, 10 or more people killed, etc. These look at any sort of event, anything that's reported in the media as being a disaster event. And basically they plotted them over a 40-year period. And you can see in Cali here how the distribution of events changes as the city is urbanizing. So you can see in the top left part how it's these urban areas in the center which are most affected, and then as the city is urbanizing sort of in concentric rings going out, we see more and more risks kind of going outwards, and as the center part is being the infrastructure is being improved, etc., there's less disaster events there. And also these events follow along either steep slope areas or places along riversides also. So this shows that if we look at sort of at a smaller scale at events, we see, and especially looking at these small scale disaster events at the city scale, we see a lot more events actually. And if we even go down into a more focused and more concentrated area, this one database, Mandisa database, which is in Cape Town, has recorded over a 10-year period dwelling fires. So it's a single type of disaster event. But what it shows is that there's actually a massive scale of these small disaster events. And that these type of events are usually not part of any urban risk calculations. This database found 8,554 events over the 10-year period, affecting 40,000 people in Cape Town, not just in Joe Slovo, but over all of Cape Town. And if we look at the cost, I mean, they tried to look at what were the costs for these type of events. So just in one community, over 1 year, the total cost was almost $80,000 US for these type of small-scale fire events. And they couldn't cost in the social services cost, but looking at the cost of the Red Cross, the losses to households, and the fire services alone, it was costing $80,000 for one community. So if we look at a very small scale, we see that there are actually a lot of events that add up, both in terms of for households and for cost to public services. So the report, we also touched on a lot of other issues, one being the role of local governments, and I just want to bring it up briefly, is that it is the local governments that are usually responsible for these risk-reducing infrastructures, the infrastructure that I was pointing out for either flood infrastructure or reducing risk of fires, etc. It is usually local governments that are responsible for this, and they're the ones who are influencing the regulations of what is being built and where, and what type of infrastructure is being supplied and where. And that these land use changes are often driven by speculation and illegal development. And this is really something that local governments need to be able to address. Another aspect that we touched on in the report is the role of communities in rebuilding and in risk reduction. I think this is something that is quite central to the work of the Red Cross, and certainly something that they've been working on over the past years. But just briefly, we touched upon how disaster survivors or affected communities are often the ones who are not consulted about their future in terms of long-term risk reduction, in terms of disaster recovery, and basically that the need to support these local organizations as a key basis for long-term recovery. And the support is not only sort of technical support, but also can be direct financial support. And if you read the chapter on that, there are many very nice examples about, for example, in Aceh, how community-based organizations have been very successful in working directly with humanitarian agencies to support better recovery. So I think to conclude, I just wanted to say that I think that the focus on urbanization, and as you were talking before when we were having the lunch, that there seems to be a lot of interest in this for humanitarian agencies, and I think the issues are quite broad. And certainly addressing the longer-term governance issues is one of the main issues in terms of having long-term risk reduction versus just disaster response. So thank you for listening. Thank you.